I painted my front door blue, and it cost me $1,000. Not because I hired the wrong contractor. Not because it was some rare, expensive imported paint. But because my HOA decided my shade of blue was unapproved. That's what they said. Just that. Unapproved. What followed was a ridiculous battle over paint swatches, outdated rulebooks, and a kind of bureaucratic madness I thought only existed in satire. This isn't just a story about a front door. This is about power, pettiness, and the moment I realized I wasn't just living at home, but under a system that could find me more than my monthly car payment for something as silly as a color. It all started in early spring, about 6 months after I bought my home in Willow Creek Estates. You know the type of neighborhood. It's picture perfect on the outside. Neat lawns, American flags waving on porches, kids riding scooters up and down smooth sidewalks. It was the kind of place I dreamed of when I was living in a cramped city apartment, safe, quiet, and neighborly. The houses were practically clones of each other. But I didn't mind at first. It felt like stepping into a postcard. The house I bought was a bit of a fixer-upper, though nothing too intense. The inside needed updating, sure, but the bones were good. Structurally sound, decent roof, and a backyard that I could already picture hosting barbecues in. The front door, however, looked like it had been through a hurricane. Twice. The paint was peeling. The wood was scratched. And every time I turned the handle, it gave off the stubborn creak, like it resented me. I figured painting the door would be a simple, satisfying weekend project. Something small, to put my own stamp on the place. I didn't want to go wild. I wasn't planning on painting it neon green, or anything. Just something modern. A touch brighter than the tire maroon that had been there for years. After a quick trip to the hardware store, I landed on a color called Ocean Whisper. It was a medium blue, a little more vibrant than navy, but still classy. It had this clean, welcoming vibe to it. Not flashy, not loud, just fresh. I held the swatch up against the siding, and it looked perfect. I even checked the HOA guidelines, which were emailed to me when I moved in, but had mostly collected digital dust in my inbox. Under the section titled Exterior Home Modifications, it said paint colors should complement the surrounding homes and reflect neutral or subdued tones, earth tones, grays, whites, tans, or muted blues. That last part, muted blues, was all I needed to see. Ocean Whisper wasn't electric or fluorescent. It was muted. It was a blue. I was in the clear. The painting went smoothly. I took my time with the prep work, sanded down the door, taped off the edges, and laid down a drop cloth to protect the porch. 2 coats later, and I was thrilled. The new blue gave the whole front of the house a lift. It made everything pop without standing out in a bad way. My neighbor from across the street, Mrs. Langford, even called out from her garden, "Love the new door. Looks sharp." I didn't think about it again until about a week later. I came home from work to find a plain white envelope tucked under my doormat, marked urgent. Inside was a letter from the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. It looked official. Logo at the top, bold type, lots of legal language. But my eyes zeroed in on the line that said, "You are hereby fined $1,000 for violation of HOA exterior aesthetic standards." My heart sank. The letter continued. "Your recently painted front door is not compliant with our approved color palette. The color selected, Ocean Whisper, exceeds the saturation limit for acceptable blue tones. Please remit payment within 30 days or risk further penalty." That was it. No paint chart. No explanation of what saturation limit meant. Just that I had broken the rules. I reread it 3 times, thinking maybe I misunderstood. I hadn't. They were fining me $1,000 over a paint color that, according to their own documents, was allowed. I went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and called the HOA number listed on the letter. It rang 7 times before someone answered. An older-sounding woman with a voice like someone who'd been answering annoying questions for 30 years. "Yes, the fine is correct," she said flatly, as if reading from a script. "Your door does not meet the HOA standards for color uniformity. It's outside the spectrum." I asked if she could send me the approved spectrum or a paint list to compare. "That's not how it works," she said. "The architectural committee makes that determination." Based on what? I asked. On community standards, she replied. I hung up more confused than ever. What exactly were community standards? This was the first time I was hearing about a specific palette. I checked the welcome packet I had gotten when I moved in. There was a vague section with a few color names: colonial blue, slate mist, heritage gray, but no paint codes, no manufacturers, no visual references. I Googled colonial blue and got 6 wildly different shades. How was anyone supposed to know what was acceptable? Over dinner that night, I told Casey, my partner, about the fine. They were livid. They want $1,000 because they didn't like the exact blue you picked? That's insane. I agreed. We looked up our HOA's bylaws together and discovered something even more absurd. The architectural committee that made these decisions wasn't made up of professionals. It was just 3 residents elected by a small group every few years. No design background, no training, just long-time residents who got to decide what everyone else's house could look like. I started wondering if this was about more than just a color. The next day, I walked around the neighborhood. I took pictures of every front door I passed. There were definitely other blue doors, some darker than mine, some even brighter. A few houses had red or green doors. One even had a bright yellow one. None of them looked offensive or out of place. So why was I singled out? That's when I ran into Jenna. She lived 2 houses down and was known for being a stickler for rules. She always had a tape measure in her garage and had once left a note on someone's mailbox saying it was an inch too tall. I asked her if she knew anything about the door color rules. She gave me a tight smile. Oh yes, I saw your new door. It's very bold. I explained I had read the guidelines and thought it was allowed. Well, the guidelines are just that, guidelines, she said, adjusting her sunglasses. The committee has a final say. They want to preserve the character of the neighborhood. We don't want it to start looking like a rainbow village. That phrase stuck with me. Rainbow Village. Was that what she thought of my soft coastal blue? This wasn't about rules. This was about control. Aesthetic policing disguised as community upkeep. I thanked her and walked away, biting my tongue. I decided not to pay the fine. Not yet. I wanted to challenge it properly. I emailed the HOA requesting a hearing or meeting to appeal the decision. They responded 2 days later, saying I could present my case at the next HOA board meeting, scheduled for 3 weeks out. In the meantime, they said I could avoid further penalties by repainting the door immediately. I wasn't going to do that. I didn't believe in backing down just because someone in the committee didn't like the color blue I chose. I had done everything in good faith. I followed the vague rules. I checked the tone. I wasn't going to be bullied by a group hiding behind ambiguity. In those 3 weeks, I started gathering everything I could. I printed out the paint manufacturer's information, showing that Ocean Whisper was categorized as a soft blue. I compared other approved shades. I took pictures of other homes in the neighborhood with bolder colors. I documented everything. I also started quietly asking around. When I mentioned a fine to a couple of other neighbors, they gave me sympathetic looks. One said they were once fined $200 for putting up a seasonal wreath a few days before Thanksgiving. Another said he repainted his garage trim and got fined because he didn't get pre-approved, even though it was the same color. The more I listened, the clearer it became. The HOA was enforcing rules inconsistently and without transparency. They counted on most people just paying up to avoid the hassle. Well, not me. As the HOA meeting drew closer, I started getting nervous. It felt ridiculous, standing up a room full of people to defend my choice of paint color. But I wasn't just fighting for a door anymore. I was fighting for fairness, for clarity, and for the right to make reasonable decisions about my own home. And deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. Maybe if I stood up, others would too. The door may have been blue, but the line I was drawing was clear as day. The night of the HOA meeting, I walked into the Willow Creek clubhouse with a folder clutched tightly under my arm. It was packed with everything I had: photographs, color swatches, printed emails, and even a physical paint sample from the hardware store. I wasn't there to shout or make a scene. I just wanted someone to admit that this was unreasonable, that this wrong shade of blue nonsense was exactly that, Nonsense. I wanted fairness. I wanted logic. And most of all, I wanted that fine to go away. The room was already half full when I arrived. Folding chairs were arranged in rows facing a long table at the front where the HOA board sat. 5 people, all in their 50s or 60s, with folders of papers in front of them like they were running a courtroom. At the center was Mr. Campbell, the president. A stern, square-jawed man with a buzz cut that hadn't changed since the Cold War. I'd seen him around before, always walking the neighborhood with a clipboard, like he was still on patrol. I took a seat near the front. A few neighbors I recognized nodded politely. Others avoided eye contact. One woman sitting 2 seats down whispered to me that she was there to ask permission to plant sunflowers in her front yard. They turned me down last year because they said it attracted bees, she said, eyes rolling. The meeting started like any other official gathering. Approval of minutes, treasurer's report, a boring update on landscaping. Then Mr. Campbell cleared his throat and looked down the agenda sheet. Next item, homeowner appeal regarding exterior color violation. Mr. Alex Brenner, please step forward. I stood, my palms sweating a little, and walked to the podium. I opened my folder and took a breath. Thank you, I began. I'm here to respectfully dispute the $1,000 fine I received for repainting my front door. I'd like to show that I followed the guidelines to the best of my ability and that the color I chose falls within the parameters described in the HOA's own documents. Campbell didn't look up. One of the board members, a woman named Linda who wore a heavy gold necklace and had a clipboard full of notes, gave me a short nod. I continued. I chose a color called Ocean Whisper. It's a muted blue, soft mid-tone, not bright or neon or garish. According to the document I was given when I moved in, blue tones are allowed as long as they are muted. There's no specific list of acceptable shades, no swatches, and no numerical references for color saturation. So I went with what I thought was tasteful and compliant. I handed them a printed page from the manufacturer showing the paint's color family and description, along with photos of my door. Campbell finally looked up. The problem, Mr. Brenner, he said slowly, is not that you chose blue. It's that the particular blue you selected is more vivid than what we traditionally allowed. I blinked. I understand. But how are homeowners supposed to know what vivid means in this context? There's no defined standard. How can I follow rules that aren't specific? Campbell folded his hands. We've always relied on the architectural committee to make that determination. It's subjective, yes. That's why we exist. To maintain harmony in the neighborhood. So I can be fined $1,000 for a rule that's based on someone else's opinion? I asked, my voice sharpening. Not a clear guideline, not an actual code, just a subjective feeling? That's how it's worked for 20 years, said Linda. I've walked the neighborhood. I continued. There are houses with brighter doors than mine, red, green, even yellow. Are those homes out of compliance? That's not relevant to this particular case, Campbell said. How is it not relevant? If the rule is enforced inconsistently, then it's not a rule, it's a preference. And people shouldn't be fined $1,000 over preference. That got a murmur from the room. A few neighbors looked up from their phones and nodded. Campbell's mouth tightened. We're not going to debate the entire process tonight. The color is outside the approved tone range, and the fine stands unless the door is repainted or the board votes to waive it, which, based on precedent, we're not inclined to do. I couldn't believe it. That was it. No vote, no discussion. Just a decision made behind closed doors and wrapped in the word precedent. I left the meeting furious. On the way out, a couple of neighbors stopped me to offer quiet support, but most kept their heads down. The mood was more scared than sympathetic. People didn't want to rock the boat. I couldn't really blame them. The HOA had a reputation for being petty, and a few of these board members had lived in the neighborhood since it was built. They knew how to weaponize the rules. When I got home, Casey was waiting with a glass of wine and a concerned look. I explained what happened, and their response was immediate and sharp. This isn't just about the door. They're hoping you'll give up because most people do. But if they can't even explain the rules clearly, maybe they shouldn't be allowed to enforce them like this. That night, I went online. I started reading everything I could find about HOA rights, homeowner rights, fines, appeals. I discovered that in many states, HOAs have a shocking amount of power. They can impose fines, place liens on your property, even foreclose if you ignore them long enough. But that power came with legal obligations, transparency, consistency, due process. And that's where things got interesting. On a hunch, I joined a Facebook group called HOA Accountability USA. It had nearly 50,000 members, all of them from neighborhoods like mine, with stories that made mine look tame. One guy had been fined for painting his shutters eggshell instead of ivory. A woman in Arizona was ordered to remove a flower bed she'd had for 5 years because a new member of the committee found it distracting. I posted my story, just the basics. Within hours, the responses poured in. One member messaged me privately and said, "Request the Architectural Committee's meeting notes." In most states, you have a right to them if the HOA is registered as a nonprofit corporation. See what their justification was. If it's not documented, you've got a legal case. I didn't even know that was possible. I checked my state laws. Sure enough, HOAs had to keep and provide meeting records upon written request. The next morning, I drafted a formal letter asking for the committee's minutes regarding my fine, their process for determining color violations, and any documentation showing their approved color palette. I sent it certified mail and waited. While I waited, I did something I hadn't done before. I posted my story on our neighborhood's community app. Not in an aggressive way, just a simple message. "Hi neighbors, I wanted to share something that happened recently. I was fined $1,000 by the HOA for painting my front door blue, the same kind of blue you see on dozens of homes in our area. I followed the guidelines as they're written, but was told the shade I chose was too vivid. No paint list, no prior warning. I'm appealing the fine, and in the process, I've discovered that a lot of these rules are being enforced without transparency. If this has happened to you, or if you paid a fine you didn't think was fair, please reach out. I'm working on something that could help all of us." I expected silence. What I got was the opposite. Dozens of comments flooded in. People began sharing their own stories. One person had been fined $150 for a holiday wreath that had blinking lights. Another said the HOA made them remove a small decorative birdhouse because it attracted squirrels. A retired veteran wrote that he had been fined for putting a flagpole in his yard because it was too tall, despite following state guidelines. The more people spoke, the clearer it became. The HOA was enforcing a version of the rules that suited whoever happened to be in charge. A few people, brave ones, messaged me and said they wanted to organize a meeting of residents to discuss reform. I said I'd help. We planned an informal get-together at the park for the following weekend. Then the letter came. It was from the HOA's management office. A bland document informing me that my request for documentation was being considered, but would require additional time due to record availability. That was their way of saying they didn't expect anyone to ever ask for records, and now they were scrambling. I sent them a follow-up letter, this time referencing the specific statutes from the state homeowner law, highlighting that refusal to provide records within a reasonable time could constitute a violation of homeowner rights. I CC'd a lawyer, not mine, just a name I found online who specialized in HOA disputes. It was enough to get their attention. 2 days later, they emailed a scanned PDF of the meeting minutes. They were handwritten, barely legible, but one thing stood out. Under my case number, it simply said, "Color is too saturated, not in keeping with community tone." No comparisons, no charts, no metrics, just a vague sentence with no supporting evidence. That was the final straw. With Casey's help, I filed a small claim court petition to dispute the fine. I wasn't suing for damages, just asking the court to void the fine based on the HOA's failure to define its policies and lack of documentation. It cost me $75 to file. The moment I submitted the paperwork, I felt something shift, not just in me, but in the neighborhood. More people started reaching out. At the park meeting, 15 homeowners showed up, all with stories of ridiculous fines, unclear rules, and a board that ruled with tight grip and little explanation. Someone proposed forming a neighborhood reform committee to push for changes to the HOA charter, more transparency, term limits for board members, and a requirement that any rule enforcement be backed by written policy and visual evidence. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was bigger. It was about the dozens of people who had been intimidated into silence by a system they thought they couldn't challenge. And now that they saw someone standing up, they were beginning to believe they could too. As I prepared for the court date, I felt nervous but strangely hopeful. The door had started as a simple home improvement project. Now it was a symbol, not just of color, but of clarity of choice and of the right to be treated with fairness in your own community. I wasn't fighting over blue anymore. I was fighting for every homeowner who had ever felt powerless against their own HOA. The courthouse wasn't the imposing marble column building you see in movies. It was a modest government complex off a quiet street, surrounded by rows of parked minivans and office buildings with mismatched blinds. I arrived 30 minutes early, dressed simply but neat, my same now well-worn folder tucked under one arm, stuffed with every piece of evidence I had compiled over the last month. This was it, the final chapter in what started with a single can of paint. Inside, the courtroom was small. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The judge, a gray-haired man with reading glasses and a kind but tired face, was already seated when I was called up. I took my place on one side of the room. Across from me sat a woman I'd never seen before, Janice Harding, the HOA's legal liaison. Not Campbell, not Linda, just someone hired to show up and read from a piece of paper. Janice opened with a confident, rehearsed tone. She stated that the HOA had the right to enforce aesthetic guidelines in the interest of neighborhood conformity and property value preservation. She referred to the CC and RS, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, saying they granted the HOA authority to impose fines for non-compliance. She cited my violation, painting my door with a color outside the acceptable visual tone. The judge raised his eyebrows slightly. And what specific color guidelines were provided to the homeowner? Janice handed him the same faded document I'd received when I moved in. No paint swatches. No manufacturer codes. Just vague names like slate blue and sand dune. He turned the page a few times, then looked at me. Mr. Brenner, your response? I stepped forward, calmly. Your Honor, I don't deny painting the door. What I'm contesting is the legitimacy of the fine based on unclear and inconsistently enforced standards. The document they refer to doesn't provide measurable criteria. It simply lists generic color names without defining what counts as acceptable saturation, tone, or brightness. It also doesn't mention the specific process used by the architectural committee to approve or deny colors. I handed the judge a printed side-by-side comparison of Ocean Whisper next to Slate Blue, both from the same paint brand. The colors were barely distinguishable. In addition, I continued, the HOA failed to provide me with any formal notice prior to issuing the fine. They offered no opportunity for correction, no clear guidance, and denied my appeal based solely on subjective language like too vivid and not in keeping with the community. The judge nodded slowly, flipping through the documents. I also obtained the committee's handwritten meeting notes, which include no technical reference, just a single comment, too saturated. I've included those in my submission. He read silently for a moment. Did the HOA provide you a palette or list of approved colors at any time? No, Your Honor. Did they offer you a warning or grace period before fining you? No, sir. The first I heard of any issue was the fine itself. Janice tried to respond, but the judge held up a hand. I've seen enough. He turned back to me. Mr. Brenner, I find that the HOA acted without sufficient clarity or consistency in their enforcement of aesthetic standards. While homeowners associations are allowed a degree of discretion, they must apply rules in a way that allows residents to understand and comply. In this case, the lack of a defined, accessible standard leaves too much room for arbitrary decision-making. He paused, made a note, then looked back up. The court rules in your favor. The $1,000 fine is voided. Furthermore, the HOA is encouraged to revise their documentation to include measurable, specific criteria for future enforcement actions. I didn't cheer. I didn't fist pump. I just exhaled. Something I hadn't realized I'd been holding in since the day I found that envelope under my doormat. Outside, I called Casey. It's over. We won. I could hear the relief in their voice. Good. About damn time. Word spread quickly. Within a day, my phone lit up with texts and messages from neighbors. Some were just congratulations. Others were longer, more emotional. A woman down the block said she felt intimidated by the HOA for years. Another man, a father of 3, said they'd been too scared to hang curtains visible from the street after getting a warning letter the year before. Suddenly, people were talking out loud about things they had whispered for years. The weekend after the ruling, our neighborhood reform group held its second meeting. This time, almost 40 people showed up. People brought printouts, past warning letters, photos of their supposed violations. It wasn't just about paint or mailboxes or reeds anymore. It was about power, about how the people who were supposed to preserve the peace had instead created tension and fear. And now, for the first time in years, people wanted to push back. At the meeting, one of the newer residents, a young woman named Diana, stood up and proposed a motion to formally petition for changes to the HOA charter. We wanted accountability. We wanted all violations to be documented with photos and citations from clearly defined rules. We wanted the color guidelines to be replaced with a real palette, one with actual manufacturer numbers, updated annually and approved by a transparent vote. We also pushed for board term limits. No more the same faces rotating through every position for a decade. 3 weeks later, we submitted a formal motion with 60 homeowner signatures, enough to trigger a mandatory vote at the next annual HOA meeting. The vote was contentious. Campbell argued, predictably, that the new rules would lead to a breakdown in visual standards, a decline in property values, and chaos. He warned of pink houses and striped garages and flamingos on every lawn. But the crowd had changed. People were no longer nodding quietly. They were asking questions. They were holding documents. They had learned how things worked and how they could change them. The reforms passed. Over the next 6 months, a new board was elected. Campbell didn't run. Linda did and lost. I didn't run either, but I joined the newly created Architectural Review Advisory Panel. We work with local designer to create an official color palette. 40 approved door colors, complete with paint codes, names, and printed swatches available in the clubhouse. No more guessing. No more tone disputes. The new rules required all violations to be accompanied by a photo, reference to a clearly defined regulation, and a warning letter before any fine was issued. Fines had to be reasonable and could be appealed at any monthly meeting with an unbiased vote. It wasn't perfect. Bureaucracy never is. But it was better. And it was fair. Months later, I was walking the neighborhood one evening when I passed by my house and noticed something small that made me smile. A tiny handprint near the bottom corner of the front door. One of the neighbor's kids must have touched it after playing outside. The smudge of dirt had left a perfect little mark across the lower panel. I left it there, not because I like dirt on my door, but because it reminded me that homes are meant to be lived in, not regulated like factory shelves. That night, as I stood on my porch looking out across the street, I realized something deeper had changed. Not just the rules. The feeling of the neighborhood itself. People waved more, talked more, laughed more. I'd like to believe it wasn't just coincidence. The battle over the color blue taught me more than I ever expected. It taught me how fear and silence can grow when no one pushes back. How a few people with too much power can turn community into control. But it also taught me that people will show up if you go first, if you stand up, if you raise your voice just loud enough to remind them that they have one too. The door's still blue. Ocean whisper. Same exact can. Every time I walk past it, I think about how easily I could have just repainted it and paid the fine. Moved on. Forgotten it. But if I had, nothing else would have changed. So here's my question to you. Have you ever been fined by your HOA for something ridiculous? A garden gnome? A bird feeder? Maybe the way you park your car, or what color your patio furniture is. If so, I want to hear from you. Share your story in the comments below, because the only way these things change is when we stop staying quiet, when we compare notes, when we push back. And if you've never had to deal with an HOA, consider yourself lucky, but keep your eyes open, because what happened to me could happen to anyone. All it takes is one wrong shade of blue. Subscribe for more stories like this. I've got a wild one coming next week about a neighbor who was fined for hanging Christmas lights before Thanksgiving. You won't want to miss it.